Hello everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. And if you can, please write in the chat box quickly because we're gonna have a blast tonight and it will be on Renaissance criticism. You might be wondering there is only, like Philip Sidney is there to learn, but remember there are so many people that is important in Renaissance criticism and in your exams perspective as well, because they have started asking little bit close kind of question from Renaissance criticism. Obviously you're going to get at least 2 to 3 questions on uh, Philip Sidney, but also they have started asking about Samuel Daniel. Of course Bacon is our they they are asking, but remember tonight is going to be a blast. Like previously we already discussed our Indian classical criticism, right, with a lot of code, remember. Then we had also European classical criticism where we talked about Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, and couple of more, right? And tonight it's going to be again about Sidney, Campion, Samuel Daniel, and many more. So sit back, relax, and what enjoy the session. And whatever the doubt you have, or if there is some network issue or anything in between, you can write in the chat box, right? So I will know, and whatever you want to ask you can always post there, and I will interact with you uh, in real time. So I hope, remember, whoever is joining right now, whoever is listening, वो लाइक ज़रूर करना बहुत ज़रूरी है, ठीक है? क्योंकि इससे क्या होगा कि आई विल बी लिटिल बिट motivated to take another session on. Of course we will be going through, like tomorrow or maybe the day after tomorrow, we're gonna talk about neoclassical criticism, and then we'll move forward and we'll just jump into the romantic criticism, then Victorian criticism, and like that in a series we'll end up talking about psychological criticism. All these theories are there, right, and cultural studies. So to motivate me, like जरूर करना भाई लोग, भाई बहनों, सब ठीक है. So let's begin. uh, First of all, these are our note from where we are studying, right? So we already had discussion on all the codes in classical criticism. If you remember, if anyone joined the session before, you can write here in the chat box, can see, like bharbhas ka bharbam, remember that? So all these ananda, abhav, bhava, all these things are there, right? All these codes you can write down in the chat box, whoever was there in that session. And then whoever was there in classical European classical criticism, you can also write the code like Aristotle's code we had, right? Everything from all the term hemertia, all these stuff, right? Catharsis, like my character is my copy of my character, all these stuff we have made awesome code on it, remember that, right? So let's begin our again this is all about Indian classical criticism. Again it is so quite covered a lot of ground in classical criticism already. uh, Let me see where it's questions we have already discussed, whatever they have asked in the past, remember. We also talked about Aristotle poetics, not only poetics, but we also talked about his drama part and also poetry part, remember that. And see, that kind of code we had. My copy is proud and happy for my new retribution, but my harmful tragic flaw and uncertain identity makes my personality is a reversing and purifying catharsis. So through this whole sentence you will remember complete all the poetics, and another code is like that: my plot is my ethical character, my thoughts dance with lyrical diction, with melodic muse spectating up. So remember all these are what also the meaning in that code. So again, you can take a snapshot and you can read it later, right? Take a snapshot, pause the video, and take a screenshot, right? So that was all about there. Tonight it's gonna be on, again the questions are there. Okay, Plato's Republic, again the questions are there, again the questions. Yes, now we are in our chapter 2, which is Renaissance criticism, right? So again, we will try to cover it within 45 to 1 hour. We won't exceed more than that. So whoever is there, again, like the video and leave a comment so I can see whoever is there, right? Okay, come on guys, join quickly. Okay, the Renaissance criticism. So, our topic for today is Renaissance criticism. So, in the Renaissance, you should understand one thing, that criticism kind of, started taking shape. From where? That Aristotle Poetics, and it was translated in Latin 1498 by Giorgio Valla. Remember that question they have asked in your exam. So, the first and foremost is our Lodovico Castelvetro. Remember, Renaissance criticism this guy is, and his contribution is for what? The rise of new classicism in drama. And he emphasized a strict version of Aristotle's three unities, and that's what he is famous for. And he is famous for the translation Poetica di Aristotle vulgarizata e spota, whatever, however you can pronounce, you can. Otherwise, you just have to remember that there are other guy than Philip Sidney, right? So the Poetics of Aristotle was translated into vulgar language, and the title was The Poetics of Aristotle with commentary on it. And remember, it's a Italian Renaissance commentary. Then we have William Caxton. So everybody knows about William Caxton, but do you know that why this guy is important? Because he's the one who brought printing press, and because of that printing, everybody was able to read the great works like what? Recall of History of Troy. Remember that question they have exam, the first work. And remember, he was the first English retailer of books, printed books, and he was known to produce also the Canterbury Tales and Aesop's Fables in 1484. So that's why this guy is important in our Renaissance criticism. Then what? Humanism. So that term started taking shape here, and how it was? Remember that studia humanitasia. So that humanist was coined for this teaching, and humanism include not only the thoughts and the whatever the process is there, but also grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and philosophy. Everything the humanism can be seen in all this. And it started where? In Italy. That was the birth of Renaissance humanism. And mostly the work from if you see the critical point of view, that criticism point of view, then all the work was from Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. Why these are important? Because they started kind of replying whatever the kind of a blame that they have put on. Like Plato said, what? The poetry should be banned from the ideal state. Poets are liar. Poets have no knowledge of the world, right? They weak our senses. All these things. Who said? Plato said, right? Who replied? Mentioned it, and Philip Sidney said that poets are the least liar. So that thing, these are very important. Petrarch of humanism, right? And Christian humanism can be seen in Sidney, Spencer, and Milton in our England, in the Britain. So that was about humanism. Now let me tell you of the Castiglione and why this guy is important, because of the work, the book of the courtier, and he was writing it because for all the upper class people, to how to rule the world, all these stuff, right? So that's what it is important in the code. And again, Sir Thomas Eliot, they have asked a question on it because he is famous for the book of governor, and that was in your chronological order. And again, it is about what, how to train all these statesmen properly. So that book was all about that training. And then what it dedicated to Henry the Eighth. Remember Henry the Eighth, who had several wives, and some of them he beheaded and all. And our Ali was involved, Thomas More was involved. All these stuff are there. We already discussed everything in our previous session, right? When we were talking about Elizabethan period. And if you haven't watched it, you should check out the playlist and go and watch. It's very important. And of course, we have all covered all kind of questions as well, whatever they have asked in your exam. So that's all are there. So Eliot, remember the book of governor, very important. Usually they ask question in chronological order. So there is another guy in our Elizabethan, another critic, and who was actually kind of telling all these statesmen, so how to interact, how to kind of all these instructions are there. So remember that, what, mirror of man's life, the moral lessons as a mirror of man's life. So that is important phrase in this work, to convey the ill effect of evil. Another phrase is important. Again, Roger Ascham. You everybody must have heard about Roger Ascham because of what, Toxophilus. And it is not like a lover, a bow. Why it is there? Because the style is important. The style it is written is very important, because Bacon also kind of employed this style. So that's very important. The book promote the practice of shooting with long bow and a higher composition of in English, very important. And it is also the first book on archery, and it is written in Platonic dialogue between, like in Plato's, right? We have dialogues between Glaucion and other, like Socrates and all. Same with here, Toxophilus and Philologus. And what other in that Platonic dialogue is written? Our what? Uh, our work from Dryden. Remember that, very important, right? So, and he is famous for not only the Toxophilus but the schoolmaster. Very important is this work only, why? Because it was a treatise on teaching. As you know, he was a tutor, right? Asham, he was teaching all of his important figure at that time. So he has written that schoolmaster, all the instruction how to teach and all these things, right? And the book covers bringing up of youth, very important. And then we have another guy, which is George Gascoigne, very important, 1534. Remember his lifespan, and he's only important because of one thing that is mentioned here, certain notes on instruction concerning the making of furs. And you might be wondering why I have mentioned this work, because George Herbert, right? What kind of poem he was writing? Right, it was actually writing like all the like wing, right? All these like altar, all the shape kind of poems. So that was discussed there as well. Remember Putenham inspired what George Herbert to write that in the kind of different, like here as you can see, uh, George Herbert is there, remember. Elizabethan shape poem. As you know, all these, this kind of poem was written, remember, all these shape of the poem are there, if you know. And it was also uh, like this kind of shape was there in the poem. And this shape, of course, this shape. So these shape, you know, are there mentioned where in Putenham, the art of English poesy. Very important. Remember, he also talked about religious, didactic, satirical, and epitaph. And Sidney, what he talked about it? Do you know? Write in the chat box quickly. Otherwise, I'll mention anyway. He criticized poets like White, Surrey, and Chaucer. Remember the art of English poesy. Then there was, the defense of rhyme by Samuel Daniel. Very important, that we'll talk about. And Stephen Gusson. Why this guy is important? Because of our Sydney, right? Because of this school of abuse. And what he said in that containing pleasant invective against poets, pipers, player, jester, and such like caterpillar of common. And what he said, these all these drama, promote what? The business of prostitute. And tragedies are characterized by their evil and criminal themes, and comedies for their bawdry, flattery, immorality. All these things he has discussed. And remember, all these things are replied by our Philip Sidney. And he also mentioned some of the character like Cook's Knave and Parasite. And this was dedicated, this book was dedicated to Philip, none other than our Philip Sidney, who wrote what? Defense of Poesy, right? An Apology for Poetry. Remember, there are two names with the uh, An Apology for Poetry and the Defense of Poesy. Both are there, as you can see here. Right, we already discussed like in detail Philip's previous session. And watch, you can go and watch. We also discussed An Apology for Poetry there, but again I will talk about it one more time, because जितना भी पढ़ो एन अपॉलॉजी फॉर पोइट्री उतना कम है, क्योंकि यू आर गेटिंग व्हाट? एटलीस्ट 3 to 4 question on apology for poetry, because two will be the direct, two will 2 questions will be direct and one will be indirect, or one direct or two indirect. So definitely you 3 questions from An Apology for Poetry. So in that case, as I told you, जितना इसमें ना हो सके, if you can go for the text it's good, but otherwise here in our notes everything is there, whatever they have asked in the past, all these points, right? So it's very important that you should actually consider reading it, all these. Again, if you want these notes, what you have to do, you just join Telegram and message me there, and I will tell you the process how to get all these notes. Anyway, these notes are available in our course as well. So the Defense of Poesy, remember the date, very important. You will get question from that also. 1582 it was composed, but published very late after his death, 1595. So that these two dates are very important. Right, and as you know, it is the finest piece of Elizabethan literary criticism. And what we do in our, when we read our literary criticism, what happened? People, you start reading from here, An Apology for Poetry. But remember, there are so many things, because the trend has started, like uh, 10 to 15 years before Philip Sidney wrote An Apology for Poetry. So that's why we are actually covering every single stuff in Renaissance criticism. And why it's important? Because in your exam they have asked it, and I'll tell you what kind of question they have asked. Right, they have asked about the schoolmaster, they have asked about Tocqueville, they have asked about Caxton, right? And they have asked about Samuel Daniel, Putenham, all these people. You have already got questions in your like way back, like 7 to 8 years ago, and they have started again from as you can see, Samuel Daniel. They used to ask about Delia and all, but now there are his criticism of a rhyme and all these things, right? So let's move back and jump back to our Sidney. And as you know, it is what he refutes what Plato's ban on poets in his Republic or the Ideal State, and it was more also partly motivated by Stephen Gausson's attack on the stage. And Gausson dedicated, as you know, in previous slide we talked about that it was dedicated to Sidney, the school of abuse, and you know the date, like 1579. And Gaussen work, as you know, it was very famous work at that time because it was all about what the kind of uh, bad the stage, right? So Sidney primarily addresses broader objection of poetry like Plato's. And if you have listened our session on Plato's, you will know what kind of thing he said about the poetry, right? And much attention is also given to Edmund Spenser. So Sidney mentioned Edmund Spenser, his work, very important. And Sidney described poetry as creating a separate reality. And what else he said? No art delivered hath not the work of nature. All these points are important because they have asked in your exam. So poetry as mimesis, like Aristotle said, and also Plato said. Plato not, as you know, Plato not only said one but like twice, right? Twice, remember, from reality. And the poet is the creator of new reality. Who said? Our Sidney. And poetry must, remember, that is the kind of final outcome. I mean, the goal of poetry should be what? Teach and delight. Do you know this is Horace stated, and teach and instruct. Remember, teach and entertain. All these are there in our. So as you know, Sidney what? As Plato said, poets are liar, and Sidney said what? They are the least. The reply. As he said, the poets are have no knowledge of the world, right? What he said, Sidney never claimed to know the truth, right? Or mislead. And what about drama? Observe neither rules of honesty, civility, and drama fails to meet poetry's standards of excellence. So remember what he said, that poetry is superior to drama, right? Poetry leads men toward what? Virtue and moral behavior. Poetry is superior from history and philosophy. Poetry inspire, remember, teach and inspire another through truth, imaginative creativity. Very important. Epic and heroic, he said, these are the top poet. And it, what is that? Inspire and instruct, or teach and inspire. So remember that epic and heroic, it is on the top. Loftiest, inspire and instruct, very important. And pastoral is what? In the second list, he said humble life. Then there is elegy, which shows what? Pity. Then we have iambic poem, which is wickedness. And the satire is radical. And what he said about the comedy, delight and laughter, and it is the lowest form of poetry, right? So folly and weakness. And tragedy, uncertain of the word, pity and awe, the fall of tyrant, unity of time, place. And so not only he talked about poetry, right? He talked about drama and the theater as well, because as you know, it's a reply of what? School of abuses, right? And what he said about the lyric, praiseworthy courage. And what he said, poetry promotes virtue, right? And men abuse poetry. So that was also a reply, you know Plato's statement, right? Plato, as you know, banished from the ideal state, but Sidney argues the misuse of poetry and the decline of poetry in drama. And what else he said? Poets are made, not born, right? So that's all are important, and if you know all these, then your like one or two questions are done, kind of dusted, done and dusted, right? And Sidney calls poetry his what unelected vacation, very important, yet defends it passionately. What he said about the poor poetry, arguing the value in purifying wit, right? And remember all these quotes, they have asked question on it. Having slipped into the title of poet, I'm provoked to say something unto you in the defense of that my unelected vacation. And if you just kind of divide, if these this apology, you should know that it has seven structure: introduction, proposition, division, examination, refutation, and propagation and digression. Here we have Plato's reply, and then we have also here same Stephen Casson's. So all these are there. So we are actually talking about here. So Sidney, what is a reference classical text? He also mentioned Sidney, remember, very important, and he examines what different forms of poetry, and what are these forms. As I told you before, we have imaginative, philosophical, all these things are there, and he criticizes those with what earth creeping minds, very important. He sends a message in the behalf of all poets. And as I told you, we have religious, philosophical, and imaginative. Very important. You always get question from that. Like what are the types of or three kinds of poem that Philip Sidney talked about in an apology for poetry, and you should know that religious, philosophical, imaginative. Important, right? And Sidney states that there have been three general kinds of poetry, and not only that, what he said, the chief is what religious, which imitate the inconceivable excellency of God. You should remember this whole kind of paragraph because it's very important. And second, philosophical and imaginative poetry written by what? Right poets. So he said, you know, which type of poetry, you know Philip Sidney said about the right poets, and you should know it is for imaginative poetry, not philosophical, not religious. So these kind of question, remember, not teach and instruct, but teach and delight. And teach and instruct is by who? Can you write in the chat box if you know? This is Horace, right? And Sidney argued that poetry should prioritize what the expression of moral and philosophical ideas over the use of formal devices like rhyme, right? So he was not specific that that you should write poem in the whole complete rhyming like heroic couplet and all. It could be blank verse, but they should focus on philosophical ideas than the rhyme, right? And Sidney refutes what general objection of poetry of Plato, and you can see this in the this phrase, they are the least liar, right? So that's all there in whole work. And as you know, we have already discussed on all the textual based you know session on Sydney that you can go. We had just recently, not it's kind of very old, but very recent, like 1 or 2 weeks ago, that we have talked about who our Plato and also Sydney, right? When we were talking about Elizabethan age. So some of the text is important, like Chaucer. He praised who? Sydney Chaucer. What he said about Chaucer is that Chaucer undoubtedly did excellently in his Troilus and Cressida. So that work is mentioned, and he also had a commentary on Edmund Spenser. And Spenser, not your other, but Sephardus Calendar has much poetry in his Eclogue, indeed worthy the reading, if I not be deceived. So all these arguments are there, all the quotes are there that you can take a note, And anyway, you can download the note and read all these quotes. I'll just, talk about the important one, whatever they have asked in your exam. Neither philosopher nor historiographer could at the first have entered into the gates of popular judgment if they had not taken a great passport of poetry. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have. The world is brazen, only deliver a golden. Right, and very important, teach and delight. Writes poet about imagination. Remember, who having no law but wit, bestow that in colors on you, which is the eyes. The poet nothing affirm. Remember about the Plato, and therefore never lieth. And Plato, poetry is the mother of lies. Who Plato said, and that was the reply. Right. Another poets far exceed prose. So he said poetry is above prose. Poetry abuseth man. Again another reply, man's wit, but that man's wit abuseth poetry. Okay, so that was all about Philip Sidney, and again we have also taken all the questions of Philip Sidney, and we'll do it one more time again. But let's talk about other critic in the Renaissance period here, starting with Thomas Lodge. And why this guy is famous? Because of defense of poetry, music, and stage plays. These works are very important that you should know, and it is what he wrote it when School of Abuse published, right, by Gerson, and it was a kind of a reply, immediate reply. And in 82 we have an apology for poetry, and his defense claims that a handful of astray poet proves nothing for the whole set. So these works are important that you should know. Sir John Harrington, you should know, he also wrote about a brief apology of poetry. So tell me, what is there? I mean, you already know about an apology for poetry, but did you know that there are so many replies or things about the poetry? Because the trend has started, so you should know there are others as well. But what you have to focus on, Philip Sidney, yes, because you're definitely going to get question, but one here and there you are going to get question from all these stuff, right? And Thomas Campion, they have recently asked about it because of this observation in the art of English poesy. They have asked about it, and that was Samuel Daniels. What the defense of rhyme, as you can see here, right? Very important. So what observation in the art of English poesy? It was about against the vulgar and unartificial custom of rhyming. So it was against rhyme. So obviously we're gonna get one reply, and it was from Samuel Daniel. He wrote what? This stuff, right? A defense of rhyme. And Ben Jonson, why he is mentioned here? Because remember, timber or the discovery made upon men and matter as they have flowed out of his daily readings or had their reflux to his peculiar notion of the times. Very important, because you got a recent question based on that. Remember, it was about all about, and also about the common people language. Remember, who used our words for far later. So that trend has started in Milton, right? Johnson's t- timber or discovery, remember that here. Language most so a man speak that I may see thee. It springs out of the most retired and in most parts of us, and is the image of present of it in the mind. You can take a screenshot if you want to read more. But remember, timber is by Johnson, and it is about language and the language of a common man, right? And Francis Bacon here, we already had a thorough discussion on Francis Bacon. I'm just gonna talk about here a little bit, because we had a long session on Bacon, because as you know, you're definitely going to see one question on Bacon as well, either in chronological order or from advancement of learning, right? They have stopped asking about the essays these days, but they have started asking about the advancement of learning. Because of why? Because he talked about poetry there. And what else he talked about in that I have mentioned here, as you can see, the advancement of learning. All these things we have already talked about, but let me tell you some of the work, the two books of Francis Bacon. And remember, Instauratio Magna, simple, Novum Organum, remember, and Historia Naturae, all these things, remember that. And New Atlantis, there we get also sometime questions, but most importantly we get question from the advancement of learning here. And very important, the full title you should know, uh, Toxo, remember that, of the proficience and advancement of learning, divine and human, right? And remember, toxo, we already talked about toxophilus, right? That they have, it's very important, these style. So his structure shaped what one of the most influential work. But we'll just move. He talked about poetry, memory. So remember, human understanding divided into three segments: memory, imagination, and reason. Is relates to history, and this relates to poetry, imagination, and reason relates to philosophy. So remember, he talked about poetry. And what his other thing he said about the poetry, that poetry is superior, right? Superior from all other form, especially from the prose. And what he said, poetry is fiend history, it's a subject matter. Poetry depicts events more significant than history. Very important. And two types of poetry that he talked about is narrative and representative. Very important, as our Sidney talked about what, imaginative, right, philosophical, and what is the religious, right? Religious is top, second is our this imaginative, then philosophical. Remember, it is the top religious, then the we have about the rights of poet, that is imagination, very important, and another is philosophical. So what he said are superior to philosopher. Poets better examines compulsion, custom, and corruption. Poets are lesser than orator. So all these things he talked about. Not only the poetry, but he also talked about tennis. And John Milton is mentioned here only because of this thing, Areopagitica or Pagatia. So remember the full title, A Speech of Mr. John Milton for the Liberty of Unlicensed Printing to the Parliament of England. Very important. You get questions on that also. Right, so that thing completed. We have finished our Renaissance criticism, and if you like the session, definitely you have to write a comment or leave a like, right? So but before that, we are just gonna discuss the question here. We already discussed all these questions in our previous session, but again we will go one more time. Who said about the nothing can please many and please long, but just a representation of general nature? So it was who? Sidney, right? We just talked about it. And who among the following talked about untranslatable in his famous work, right? Okay, this question is a little bit. Okay, we are starting from this. Identify the author who stated the following lines. Here started from Sidney. Right. Identify the state there is just for literature, and secondly the literature of power, to teach function, and second is to move, and it's a rudder and the sail. This is also not from Sidney. Which PYQ I'm taking on? Was it from Sidney? Yes. So poetry according to Philip Sidney, three kind, as I told you: religious, philosophical, imaginative. Easy to answer, we just discussed. Who among the following believe that rhyme is not an integral part of poetry? Who said it? Our Philip Sidney, and of course Horace. Right. Who among the following refutes Plato's charge that poets are easy to answer, right? Philip Sidney. Again, another question. Which two of the following poets defended poetry against Plato's designation? So, as you know, we have Philip Sidney and Shelley because they have written both the kind of same work. And what an apology for poetry? The didactic function, as we told you about the religious. Remember, and if it was about the rights of poet, it could have been about the imaginative poem. So, Philip Sidney's are influenced by the Spanish. It's not important in our criticism part, but for you that it is the uh, work. Again, Plato, everybody knows. Uh, we have defense, apology, right? Aristotle rhetoric, Plato symposium. Easy to answer. Then correct the among the following. Apology for poetry by written, of course. Philip Sidney wrote the Apology for Poetry. Gusson, right? And Stephen Gusson wrote the School of Abuse in the euphemistic style. That is also true, and Sidney's style was correct. Not Gusson wrote their critical treatise in the 18th century. Definitely not. They are from the 16th century. So easy to answer. Arrange the following poets again through the chronology. So this is chronological type of question. We don't need here. And match the following response to our Philip Sidney. Individual talent is by T.S. Eliot. Sweetness and light. Catharsis. Easy to answer. We already discussed these questions in our previous session. What is the correct chronological sequence of the following texts? As you know, we have an apology for poetry first, and then we have our advancement of learning, and then we have the uses of spectator. Remember 17th, 16th, 16th, and my relation is on 18th, and how it is like contemporary. All these work explanation we have, right? Essay Ophelia, as I told you, 19th. This is Robert, again 19th. Identify the poets who has said that poetry has fallen from its pedestal as the highest estimation of learning to the laughing stock of children. So it was Sir Philip Sidney who said it. Okay, critics and text. Again, easy to answer. Ben Jonson Timber, Horace Arc Poetica, John Dryden, dramatic poesy, and we have Samuel Daniel, defense of rhyme. We just talked about it. Remember, these kind of, they have started asking questions on that also. Advancement of learning, Francis Bacon, past and present, Thomas Carlyle, illness and metaphor is by Susan Sontag. Remember Susan Sontag, remember that. And we have English Straight by Emerson. Easy to, sorry, this. Okay, why we have put it here? Because of the advancement of learning. Again, which of the following is a periodical essay? Easy to answer. Francis Bacon and Montaigne, right? And again, another question is there. In advancement of learning, Francis Bacon divides poetry into three divisions. We learned two, right? Narrative, representative, and there was another, elusive, right? And match the following again. These are about Francis Bacon, that we have Francis Bacon, or I believe is there another. So we will just talk about Francis Bacon here. Anyway, Francis Bacon's The Advancement of Learning, what draw a distinction between two kinds of truth, theological and scientific truth. Find the chronological order in terms of their period they belong. So we have here, first will definitely come Bacon, then Steele, then Dryden, then Lamb, and Victorian, our Arnold. Easy to answer, right? And Francis Bacon, The Advancement of Learning, was dedicated to our King James. Very important is that, and the correct chronological sequence of the following English non-fictional prose writers according to their, but again chronological type of question. Who is the first one? As you know, we have Bacon, then Addison, Lamb, Lamb, then we have Matthew Arnold, and then Virginia Woolf. Easy to answer if you know their order correctly. Who was the author of the this thing? Easy to answer. Novum Orgam, our Francis Bacon. Remember, these are the questions they have asked in the past. Which of the work of Francis Bacon explained the new logic and of course inductive method? So it was here in Novum Organum. Okay. So guys, that's all. We have covered our Renaissance criticism. We also have again one more talk on Bacon and of course Philip Sidney, and our Renaissance criticism is done. And in our next session we're gonna talk about neoclassical criticism. So you have to be there, and also these notes, if you want, you can call me in this number or just ping me there, and I will just tell you the process and you will get all these notes. These notes are very important because you're definitely gonna see a lot of question and you're gonna learn a lot of stuff. You don't have to wander around looking for other notes. Everything you will get here. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in our next session. And of course paper 1 is coming on your way very soon, right? So that's all guys, take care and have a today we have covered it in like less than 50 minutes, and that's a good start for us. And of course if we go in this space, we'll be able to finish whole criticism theory and culture very soon. So bye bye and take care. Good night.